Welcome to Radius of Reason. This is part 2 of our new series, Metacrisis Solutions, Creating a Third Attractor System. Now, just to quickly recap things, what is the Metacrisis? It's a collection of global challenges facing humanity and the underlying incentives responsible for creating them. Climate change, runaway artificial intelligence, nuclear proliferation, engineered pandemics. These are all examples of massive coordination failures. And in order to address these problems, we need coordination at the scale of the issues. Hence, you can make a reasonable argument that we need some sort of global governance. In our last episode, we discussed just that, a new system for international coordination, but in the spirit of what Daniel Schmachtenberger calls a third attractor, this sort of happy medium between decentralized chaos and a totalitarian dystopia. Now, to put it in more concrete terms, imagine a system like the United Nations, but far more powerful, without a military, without a peacekeeping force, yet significantly less prone to corruption, and with economic incentives that leverage the self-interest of nations to behave in ways that benefit the whole as opposed to just themselves. Now, if you're thinking this is like just a pipe dream, this is a pure fantasy, it very well may be. We're still trying to figure that part out. But today we're going to continue to explore the idea.
And I think the most important thing to highlight before we start out is that we're not necessarily advocating for the fact that we need and absolutely must have some form of one world government. I think, if anything, this is a thought exercise to consider some of the many avenues by which we can provide solutions to some of these compounding crises that humanity is facing. One world government is a method that we see as a potential way to bring about coordination at the international scale to resolve some of these things. And in the last episode, we did talk about that some of these institutions already exist. And a lot of our conversation naturally came to the point of how would you even organize an international institution that's more effective than the United Nations without implementing a model that would, first of all, be absolutely totalitarian and force this kind of model on countries, which is not what we're trying to do, but also to create a system that nobody is going to be taking advantage of, to ensure that everybody's an equal partner and everybody is able to contribute to it equally with regards to their means. Is this feasible or not? This is what we're going to talk about in this episode. But before we get into that, I think we need to get a little bit of an overview over the model that we proposed last time.
Yeah. On the subject of feasibility, before you can really talk about how to transition to a system, you kind of have to establish what that system is going to look like, at least in basic generic terms. And we hit on a few key ideas here. As Levon said, we're trying to find something that's both centralized and decentralized. So centralized in the form of, we decided on like assemblies, like these groups of governance that are drafted randomly from a pool of predetermined experts and relevant people. These assemblies would make the decisions for the group, for the collective, basically. And this is how you have a kind of centralized system. But then you also have a decentralized system in the form of, well, these assemblies have checks on each other. These assemblies are only meant to be formed for specific problems, for specific situations we find ourselves in, and then they're disbanded. So in this sense, we can start to create what Daniel Schmachtenberger calls the third attractor. And yeah, that's the basics of it.
Yeah, and just again to make sure we're fully grasping what the system is and how it works, it is based on a system of economic incentives, and what we don't want, again, to be very clear, is a military, is a punitive system. Like we want to create a thing that is so attractive that people willfully want to participate in it.
Right.
And another caveat there, or maybe a clarification / correction to what Alex had mentioned. He mentioned the draft mechanism and that it was kind of a pool of predetermined experts. And I think that's a little misleading, because what we probably envisioned was more like a draft of people, a broad range of people, but based on an eligibility criteria that makes sense in terms of, what they've contributed to society, in terms of like maybe their age, like basic parameters, not something that is, going to create kind of an elitist technocracy type of thing.
Hello. I hope you're enjoying this latest episode of Radius of Reason, where we're sitting down with our buddy Alex to talk about ways that we can overthrow America and establish a one world government.
Right. And if you want to join this movement, then hit the subscribe button, hit like, and comment on why you don't find this completely absurd.
The specifics of the draft are open to debate.
For sure. But yeah, I mean, the whole thing is really open to debate, but there's just some basic key ideas here that we think are valuable. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, so back to this idea of how do we actually transition to such a system. Obviously, you need a holistic approach. There's so many different variables, but let me ask you guys this. If you could only pick one, domain to start with, what would it be?
What do you mean by domain?
So it could be some sort of political change. Mm-hmm. It could be a grassroots cultural change, an economic change, a particular set of laws, those kind of things. How would you go about it?
Alex, you want to take a crack at the first answer?
Sure. Yeah. I think the fundamental value that needs to be instilled in the population is the value of recursive self-improvement. So one feature of this system that we didn't mention in the summary is that it also has an element of self-correction. And that's something that Nassim Taleb harps on when he talks about anti-fragility, is you need to be able to flex, you need to be able to respond, you need to be able to change in when you're put under pressure or when you encounter new data. And since this is ultimately something that has to happen from the bottom up as well as the top down, the population needs to be on board with this idea, as well as the system needs to change. I think the single best thing I could do is instill this desire, this value of recursive self-improvement. That's a good thing we should all strive for, both in our personal lives and in the systems we create.
Now, and how would you define recursive?
Yeah, as in it's a continual process that repeats itself. You never stop improving the system. Mm-hmm. You never stop improving yourself.
Right.
Let me provide an alternative definition as well. It's like an iteration that within itself calls upon itself to iterate.
To evolve and change, yeah.
Yeah.
Almost how in theory the U.S. Constitution should be a living document that constantly updates itself in accordance to the times. Good too.
More concrete.
The idea, in theory anyways.
And I think the only way to kind of start this kind of maybe uniform adoption of mindset, I think it does require what we discussed in the last episode is an element of grassroots organizing, where it does have to start at the level of your local community, be it your city, your neighborhood, whatever, where you're getting together with individuals that maybe are like-minded and working on this and starting these conversations in the immediate surroundings that you have. And then you can start building up to something greater. But I don't know if, to the credit of some of our esteemed participants in the comments section, I don't know if an imposition of this kind of mindset or culture on anybody would be effective. I think it'd be met with resistance, and it would be met with non-compliance. But if you start it as an organic growth of a movement, and I think last time we discussed this being a political movement, this being a movement that's also cultural, kind of a synthesis of realities to a certain extent, you would have to start it again at the level of your immediate community and build up from there. Those are the foundational building blocks, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think so. I think that is absolutely a key component, but certainly it's hard to imagine that being sufficient, right? It's like a necessary but not sufficient kind of
sure
action.
I mean, if we're only going to choose one thing, I don't think any of them are going to be sufficient.
But yes, I think, but I do agree with Andre that is the starting point, right? And you know, like, you know, all these videos of Daniel Schmachtenberger online talking about the Metacrisis, us trying to talk about this. I mean, this is part of that, what would be considered a grassroots movement towards trying to understand these problems and trying to see if we can actually come up with better systems. But then I think, you know, you immediately run into the stumbling block of, we've got these social media algorithms that are obviously prioritizing the antithesis of what we discuss, you know, which is hopefully, you know, nuanced, logical things that aim to benefit humanity, but are just not sexy in terms of getting views. Not to imply that the only reason we're not getting views is because of the topic itself. Clearly, there's other reasons.
It's sexy. It's got you clicks. We would be through the roof.
I mean, I grew this beard out just for more clicks, but, you know, still.
Very brief interruption to this episode to remind you, if you want to support Radius of Reason, subscribe to our channel to get the latest from our work.
And if you don't like it, then let us know in the comments below. We'll see.
It's the Daniel Schmachte beard. You know, it's trying to get his view on it.
Diet Daniel Schmachte.
I do think that the greatest irony to a lot of our conversation is that the action for it does have to happen in person. I think that you do kind of have to take the organizing approach of in-person engagement. And I think that the podcast format and the interview format that Schmachtenberger has participated in online is fantastic from maybe like an educational standpoint. But to actually implement some of these things, it has to be like on a physical, like one-on-one basis almost, because it can't be a bunch of anonymous people screeching at each other in internet comments. Like it has to be a very interpersonal, face-to-face type of organizing to really kick this off the ground, my opinion.
Well, you know, it can start online though, you know, and I think, yes, you're going to simultaneously need to see a buildup of like in-person activity, but I think to not leverage the exponential technology that we have available, it's almost like you're guaranteeing yourself to be outcompeted by worse ideas that are using the technology, right? And so, you know, we talked about the idea of hyperagents in a previous episode, and I think this is where, if you were to have figures of immense popularity and social influence, say like a Joe Rogan, but someone who was committed to the, you know, solving the Metacrisis, all of a sudden, like, that is an unbelievable like leap, you know, on this issue in terms of potentially making progress towards some solutions. I mean, the weight of what he says, the amount of listeners, and despite him continually calling himself like an idiot, like, don't listen to me, I'm dumb. Well, people do it. Like, despite all that, he just the sheer popularity, the sheer gravity of Joe Rogan propels people to kind of do the things he does. Like, everyone's taking, you know, well, all the wealthy people are taking cold showers, you know, they're doing all the little things that Joe Rogan is recommending. And so I think if we were to have like an, you know, equivalent in terms of the Metacrisis, and maybe one would argue that Daniel Schmachtenberger is the closest thing we have to that, then that is a great kind of like leverage point to use to advance this cause.
I think we have a lot of hyper agents in the world. It's just most of them either don't know about or don't care about the meta crisis.
So how do we get people? How do we get those hyper agents on board? Because again, like Daniel Schmachtenberger has been on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I'm sure people that listen to it were like, "Oh, that's pretty interesting. This guy's interesting. Has some good ideas, some good food for thought." And then they just started scrolling, and then they forgot about it, right? So how do you, apart from making podcasts like this, like how do you get that message across to the most influential people?
I think it has to be a challenge of action too, and I think that's kind of the problem with. I don't necessarily know if we can call it the self-help industry or whatever, like the general approach that Rogan takes to a lot of his shows are, but I think there's obviously you have like, let's say 5 million views on a video. What percentage of those views are actually going to take and internalize whatever, let's say that lesson of cold showers, for instance. How many people are actually going to implement that in their daily life? How many people are going to implement that on their daily life consistently and then turn it into a habit?
Yeah. I mean, this is the problem with both learning in general and self-help as well. Like most online platforms, like education platforms and most self-help books and guides, all these things that are designed to get you to change your life in some way, they have an issue where they don't stick because most people's change comes from social connections and group identity.
Precisely.
So what you'll notice is the most successful self-help and the most successful learning platforms provide a kind of community to immerse yourself in, a community that espouses these values and holds you both accountable, but also gives you a sense of identity with these values, group identity alongside these values. And that's really how you get people to change, is providing them that social framework. That's one of the key assumptions that the Guild of the Rose has, is self-help and self-improvement are ineffective if you don't tie it with community.
Here's where I think maybe the meta crisis is too broad for that, because it just encompasses everything. It's like, how do you build a community around like everything, right? Like around all of these, and it's like, I mean, you could in theory, but like this is why I do think there are these significant limits to a grassroots movement, and I think things have to get worse so that they change that cost benefit analysis of, okay, I need to now like do this thing because it's in my self-interest, as opposed to it rationally is in my self-interest, but I'm not really feeling the effects of it. So I brought this up last time and I said, we may need some sort of catastrophe that it doesn't like destroy civilization, but it does enough damage to propel us in the right, to really nudge us in the correct direction, because we're not really on course right now. And
careful, Yvonne, you're veering very closely to acceleration.
Yeah, we're going to some like evil villain stuff. I love it. Like,
I was thinking
we put a nuclear bomb in the Gulf of Mexico. And, yeah, blow up the ocean.
No, but I think, last time I kind of brought this up, and Andre, you had mentioned, well, this is exponential technology. You don't get second chances with, nuclear war. You don't get second chances with engineered pandemics. But I do think I like mostly agree with that. But I also think there is an opening there of we've created kind of like a false dichotomy of like either there's no like nuclear war or there's a complete civilizational like annihilation type of thing. And a true nuclear war could very well lead to that, when you factor in a nuclear winter and then like, blocking of sunlight and, the destruction, like agricultural catastrophe and then migration. And like, you can see the cascading effects of even, not even like a global nuclear war, but even a relatively, decent sized exchange could lead to utter catastrophe. However, let's say Putin used it in Ukraine, which is hard to understand why he would, because he's, Russia's right next to Ukraine, but you could see crazy shit happening. if there was a small exchange and it was devastating, and several countries in Europe, let's say, they got kind of the radioactive winds blown against them and all this, maybe you see a revived effort in nuclear disarmament, right? Maybe you have all these nations look at the effect of that and say, okay, like this really, this really is unacceptable. We have to do more because we just, it's just in all of our self-interest to do so. And I think you could have these events. You could have other black swan events. You could have, artificial intelligence lead to some, global economic collapse or some sort of issue. Not global economic collapse, but let's say some truly alarming economic disruption that occurs. But it's not a complete economic catastrophe. I'm saying those kind of events are possible, right? These sort of like black swan events, could those be the thing that we need to propel us toward better cooperation, better coordination?
I think yes, definitely. But I think the challenge that we're trying to discuss here is what can we do to have the infrastructure in place so that the next time there's a black swan event, you already have a movement, you already have momentum that will attract individuals to participate, right? Yeah. So if you start from the grassroots level and you start organizing and you create maybe a political party or a political movement that you are already organized, effective, and able to provide an alternative for people to join you in the event something like this happens. And I think that's exactly what, Ivan, you mentioned AI. I think we know exactly what's going to happen with AI. The writing's on the wall. We know that in the next 5 years, we're going to start seeing mass amounts of layoffs. We know that we're going to start seeing the replacement of workers across a lot of sectors. We know this because the tech companies are openly talking about this, and they're celebrating this to a certain extent. If you look at how some of the shareholder calls have been going, the promise of AI, the revenues that AI can bring. So we can hypothesize that in the near term, we're going to start seeing more and more people disenfranchised professionally because of AI tools being widely deployed within organizations. So if we have that as a guiding light, you know that you need to have some sort of infrastructure in place to catch those people into your movement when inevitably this happens. And I think one of our greatest frames of reference, and again, for the people listening, I think it's really important to emphasize this and say this very, very clearly, is that we do not, and we are not advocating for any sort of socialist model or like the return of communism. But if you look at the socialist movement in, let's say, Russia, that's, I think, a pretty good model for how you can build out a political movement independent of the ideology, but from a structural standpoint, that you had a rallying factor, that you could slowly attract membership and build out your presence in a country. And then when a massive event did hit, you were already ready to address what was going to happen. And you already had everything in place to ensure that people could join and support whatever movement forward you have going on.
Yeah. And just to bridge Levon and Andre's ideas here is, on one hand, I think it is possible that a catastrophe might be necessary to spur the world to coordinate. But on the other hand, we also don't want to hinge our entire plan on a major catastrophe happening. That's not a great idea. So I think the right thing to do is to just put your eggs in as many baskets as possible. Increase the surface area of your movement such that no matter what kind of black swan event happens, you are best situated to capitalize on that. So, for example, the idea that you need to have a global movement. So you are in as many places as possible, to that way, no matter where certain events happen, you are able to take advantage of those. You also need to make sure that this is both a political movement, but also a social movement. Like, you don't just want to be a political party, because there are people that just won't be interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
And politics isn't necessarily the only space that you want to be active in.
Mm-hmm.
You also need to have like social movements, like book clubs, or groups of people who support each other.
Yes, mutual aid groups.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we have plenty of third parties in the U.S. We have third parties that are actively, by ideology, geared towards addressing things like climate change. But there's a reason the Green Party in the U.S. isn't like massively successful, even marginally successful. Like, they're not able to implement a single one of their policy positions. And I think it's because it's not a change that's happening on like a cultural level, and because you're not creating or fostering environments that people would want to join something like that. But
I think it's not just that, though, is it, Andre? Because it's also the amount of corporate interest in favor of the status quo is simply like too much for any new party to overcome. And it's just, you just get into this problem of like, to change culture, you need to, like, again, it just goes back to the narrative warfare thing with, you've got social media, you've got algorithms here that are maximizing profit, over everything else. And they're not going to want to change that. And they're the ones setting the laws. But those algorithms are dictating like our cultural narratives now. So it's like the chicken and the egg problem here. Like, what do you, like? So I'm trying to think here. But with new parties, I think, so let me backtrack here, and just to clarify a point that Alex had made earlier, I was not advocating that we rely on black swan events to hope for some sort of transition to a better system, but I genuinely think it might be necessary. So that just to clarify that. I just don't see how you.
I understand what you're saying. To drive home your point here about the chicken and egg problem. Like, you asked earlier, what one thing we would change in order to start implementing a third attractor system, and I mentioned a cultural shift towards iterative self-improvement of self and systems. But I think my second big thing that I would want to implement, if I were given a second option, would be to drastically overhaul social media via regulation, like completely eliminate infinite scroll feeds and do really strong regulation on recommender systems, like the algorithm that serves up content to people based on their pre-existing ideas.
But is that not another case of like things have to get bad enough for society to really like rally around the idea of like, okay, we really got to fucking change?
I think they're pretty damn bad right now. Like they
are, but like to overcome the lobbying and everything, like you need, I feel like you need it to get worse. And I know Jonathan Haidt right now, the former Yale sociologist, he's really advocating for some sort of regulation on social media, in particular like age limits for the youth who are getting absolutely destroyed by the psychological effects of social media. So it is happening, Alex, to a certain extent. Maybe I just don't understand the political system well enough. I don't know like the ins and outs of it, of that power game. Like I don't know what it actually takes to make those changes. I mean, Andre, like, do you have better insight into like how would you, I don't know, pass some of these regulations? Even though I think most people now would already agree that we should make these changes, but it's not getting done. So
because I don't think there's an outlet, and I don't think there's a counterbalance. And I think a lot of like what we're going through, people often compare like the political realities in the United States to the past 100 years. Like, oh yeah, we're kind of living through this like 1920s version of history where we came out of a massive pandemic. I think that the biggest counterbalancing force in the 20th century is that you had radical movements in power around the world that kind of forced governing parties not to overindulge themselves in terms of benefiting wealthy elites or ruling classes, right? I think in the US, a lot of the reason why the New Deal was passed in the 30s is because there was this like fear that, oh shit, we're going to have our own like Bolshevik turnover in this country. And to kind of build a blow off valve, you had like the embrace of Keynesian economics and New Deal policies that put people back to work during the Great Depression. We don't have anything like that now. We don't have any threat of disenfranchised workers getting involved in radical movements because we don't really have radical movements. I think the end of the Cold War brought about the complete victory of neoliberal economics, globally speaking. You don't have alternative systems in place. And again, I'm not advocating for a communist system. I'm just saying that the threat of that even being out there brought a level of caution to how the elites of a certain country would behave. And that is coupled with also how weak labor organization this country has gotten, especially after the policies of Reagan, Bush Sr., and Clinton, and essentially like decimating the ability of labor unions to inflict any real political power or swing political power, and passing of NAFTA, the deindustrialization of the American Midwest. Like all of these things have steadily eroded away at the capacity for people to have the traditional channels of access to the traditional channels of power. Because in the past, if a company was stepping over the line in terms of its operations, if they were abusing workers, there would be the threat of a effective strike. We have strikes now, but the threat of strike in the 20th century also came with the threat of violence. That you didn't step too far forward because people would start throwing dynamite. And I'm not saying that's good, and I'm not advocating for political violence, but the fact that but the fact that the elite would always be tempered by the knowledge that at some point the people they're governing over would step in to push back. And there was vivid memories of what happened in Eastern Europe. There was vivid memories of what happened in South America. And I think that was a check, and we don't have those checks anymore. And go ahead.
Is it also because we've become too comfortable? Like there's just like, that baseline has been raised in terms of, food and like entertainment and, the sort of sedated world that we now live in. So the motivation is like significantly less, even if things aren't optimal, right?
I mean, but is it like a self-perpetuating loop? Like, do we overindulge in these things because we don't feel there's an avenue for any meaningful change? I mean, we're facing down yet another election in the United States, and not to make everything American centric. Like the Metacrisis is not exclusively American. I think to be blunt.
Thank you. Our Norwegian listeners are
right there.
Quite
yeah,
happy.
We're with you, dear Norway. But maybe even globally speaking, like, because I think this level of disenfranchisement that people are experiencing is high, at least across the major economies of the world. But with our experience in the US, we have another election coming up in November, and we have the same two candidates that weren't necessarily like making anybody that excited, although you can make the case that Trump does have an effect on people in this country with like this kind of culty status he's achieving. But I mean, talk to the average voter. Is anybody happy about their choices between Biden and Trump? No. But like, what can they do to change that? There are prescriptions of like, oh yeah, go vote in your local elections, focus on local politics. But at the end of the day,
so on a practical level though, people like they spend little time even trying to understand the basics of what their own party believes, let alone what the other party believes. Like, so I don't know, if, you can say that maybe they just feel like it's hopeless, but on the other hand, the fact that they don't even understand basic things to me is almost an indication that the root causes is almost laziness and sedation.
I think laziness.
With many people. I think maybe other people, maybe kind of people more similar to you, for example, might be less motivated because they feel it's hopeless. But I think when you look at like the middle of the bell curve, like people just kind of don't give a shit.
And I think herein lies the greatest, or one of the greatest problems that any sort of movement's going to face. And I think it's ensuring that you don't perpetuate or build out any form of resentment for that middle of the bell curve, because the power is going to come from the middle of the bell curve. And I think, and I think recognizing the fact that apathy, and I don't think it's laziness. I think it's disenfranchisement. And I think it's intentional disenfranchisement. And I think it's intentional in a way that there's an understanding if the middle was ever mobilized, shit would not fly, right? And that, I think, is, you pointed out, I don't know if this was intentional or opportunistic, but there is no hope of a movement that involves the Meta Treaty in succeeding as long as disenfranchisement and apathy is pervasive. And I think, going back to the original question at the top of the show, one thing, if we had to change one thing, it would be to bring about a system that would engage and motivate and inspire the quote unquote middle of the bell curve. And any sort of the movement like this, I think, absolutely cannot start in the hotbeds in San Francisco, in New York. I think it has to start in small towns in the Midwest. I think it has to start in Rust Belt cities.
It's not going to, though. So that's I just don't think it is. And let me clarify something. So what I'm trying to get at with the middle of the bell curve statement is that throughout I think pretty much all of human history, it's like, this is just most people. They care about things that are kind of more day to day and that are relevant to them. And it just reinforces the point I made, like, until shit really hits the fan and their genuine self-interest is very noticeably impacted, then it's always going to be difficult to get that movement going, apart from people that are already kind of on a closer to a tail end of the distribution, that are more self-motivated, that are more interested in these ideas. It's not just, you're right, it's not just laziness. That was not a correct statement on my part. It's also like people just have certain predispositions of things that they're interested in.
Yes.
And people just aren't, like, most people just don't care about these things unless it really impacts their day to day. And that's the problem with many of these Metacrisis things, and that's the problem with being sedated.
And I think it is the responsibility of the movement to convince people that this is worth paying attention to and worth getting involved in. I think that is the work that has to be done. I think, and that's where, sorry, Alex, one more thing. Yeah. That's where I think podcasts and interviews are not going to cut it. And that's when it comes down to, like, I don't want to use the fucking term, but I'm going to use it because I'm tired. Boots on the ground, like knocking on doors, meeting people, getting people to meetings, getting people, like, it has to be the job of the movement to convince people that their lives are already being impacted by this.
I want to let Alex get his word in too, but just one statement. I 100% agree with you, Andre. Like, I think we don't have any other option but to try and to get a grassroots movement going. So I'm fully on board with that. All I'm saying is I don't think it's going to be sufficient. So there's like a question of what we should do, and then there's a question of what I think is going to happen. And I think we're going to need an additional kind of spark.
Yes.
But Alex, go ahead.
So I have in the past struggled with a similar kind of cynicism where I look at the middle of the bell curve and I think, oh my God, nobody thinks about these things. Everyone is just trapped in their own laziness and their own apathy. But it was actually semi-recently when I stumbled across a podcast and blog written by a friend of mine. Her name is Eleanor David, and she has a blog called The Conversationalist. And one of the things that she does is she just invites people to chat with her. like not experts in anything, just regular people here in the Midwest. And she'll have these little chats in the car with them where she asks them questions about life and meaning and politics and social relations with people. And it always astounds me seeing these otherwise quote unquote regular people who I might bump into at a coffee shop. They have such rich experience if you just know how to tap into that. They think about things a lot more than I give them. I used to give them credit for.
And I'm sorry, but I think that kind of mindset is not constructive necessarily, because the assumption that there are regular people and there is us is going to bring a lot of problems, and there's going to bring a lot of, like, I think, and this isn't a comment on anybody that we know or the circles we run in or ourselves. I think humanity in general tends to think of, on an individual level, within an individual level of consciousness, everybody tends to perceive themselves as maybe a little bit more important or a little bit more intelligent than the people around them. I certainly fall into the trap myself. And I think the nature of the movement has to be letting go of that, to the point you made, Alex, at the start of the episode. It has to be consistently improving yourself to the point where you're also not just thinking about others as a sort of a mass that needs to be studied. And, oh, maybe, yeah, they could be constructive. They could say constructive things too. You know, if we ask them what they're feeling, like, no, I think we have to assume, and we have to operate with the baseline that everybody carries a level of potential with them. That's
what I was trying to get at, is there isn't really a isn't really a divide between us and what some people might call regular, quote unquote, regular people. That there were scare quotes intended to be used there.
And I got scared. Yeah.
Yeah. No. My point here is that I think I think it's tempting to be cynical about the middle of that bell curve, and it's important to remember that. In many ways, we are also the middle of the bell curve. We're not
absolute mid podcast.
I think, I don't know. Yeah. The podcast, it's a different story, but I think it's worth pointing out. Yes, it's not about creating some hierarchy of us versus them and the fucking elite, intellectuals versus the middle of the bell curve morons type of thing. Like, that's not what it's about. Although it's very easy to construe what Alex was saying or what I was saying as that. And some people do mean it in that way. So that makes it more confusing. What I was trying to get at, and what I think is important to acknowledge, is that there are differences between what people are interested in. That's all you have to acknowledge. And it's about the kind of this horizontal thing. It's not a vertical, like, hierarchy thing. It's a horizontal, like, distribution of, hey, there's people here that like this stuff, there's people here that like this stuff, and we have to acknowledge that difference. And by not acknowledging the difference, I think you create a false optimism and a false sense of, like, what you can achieve through purely grassroots changes. And so, yeah, I think maybe we can just leave it at that. You guys are okay. We've kind of gone down that rabbit hole a little bit. So I want to go back to an earlier point, though, that I think, Andre, you made, and we were talking about lobbying and political, like, corruption. You mentioned specifically, actually, I can't remember what you mentioned. I'm lying.
What was the fact there's no, like, counterbalancing force? There's no, like, threat of violence. There's no.
Yes. So it was related to that. And it was in the sense that the elites, they will see, like, cultural movements happen in a certain direction, and then they will try to, in general, fight against it if it's against their self-interest, provided that them fighting against it doesn't lead to, some sort of total civilizational, unrest and revolution type of thing, right? Like, that's the needle they're trying to thread, right? They're trying to eke out as much as they can, but not let it get bad enough so that shit truly hits the fan and that they're genuinely impacted by it adversely. So when it comes to this at a political level, at a more, like, diplomatic level, you can see that the lobbying efforts are going to be targeted at these kind of cultural movements, right? So we can think of climate change and we can think of oil companies, propaganda, launching propaganda against, the green movement as a whole, right? And so it's kind of like a direct kind of counterbalance to the movement. And I just had this idea. It's like, what if you try to go around that, or try to indirectly do a thing that then leads to the movement in a more organic fashion? So let me clarify what I mean by this. A lot of these issues are tied to like people's ability to think critically. Okay. And again, we just talked about how not all people are even interested in thinking critically, right? They're just interested in doing their day-to-day things. But we can make a change in the population through a better education system that does, start to skew the bell curve in the direction that we want, in terms of being able to think critically, in particular about the issues that we want them to think about, which is the things that like having good systems, like having good government, right? And thinking critically about like what makes good government, and what are these the bad practices that are currently in place, and those things. So by indirectly, let's say, targeting the education system, you now don't have the same kind of eyeballs on you, right? So like Google, Facebook, these oil companies, like they're not as focused on, okay, we've got to stop this reform to the education system. Does it make sense what I'm saying so far?
Absolutely.
So if you can then go for what, I don't want to say low-hanging fruit, because it's still a monumental thing to like reform education, but relative to, say, reforming the social media algorithms and battling the social media companies, which you're going to be outspent by them, right? By going after something like the education system, then you are using like a greater leverage point by improving the education, and hopefully organically it leads to people being more let's say attentive and more intelligent in about how they're kind of thinking about these issues.
Absolutely. And let me maybe paraphrase what you're saying. Like, you're recognizing reality as it is, and you're trying to find ways that we can combat it using the levers of power that maybe we do have more effectively available to us, where it's far more effective and reasonable for us to get involved on school boards, to, ensure that curriculums are up to standard, like things along those lines, as opposed to trying to take on Google as an entity. But if you have a well-funded school system that teaches critical thinking, that teaches and inspires curiosity, inevitably over time that would wane off Google's power or TikTok's power, because you would have a population that is going to be critically evaluating whatever's being forced down their throats.
Right. In conjunction with the grassroots movement for these kind of broader metacrisis
I think
issues and changes.
The conclusion that we came to in the last episode was that the meta-treaty model is the ultimate objective. It's what you would have to start working towards to kind of be the overarching guiding force. And I think that, you really accurately, Yvonne, called out the fact that the metacrisis is such like a big thing that the only really feasible way you could address it is to break it down in like series of steps. Like maybe phase one is improving, like addressing these problems that we talked about: apathy, lack of critical thinking, lack of interest. Okay, well, how do we get to work on that? Well, that means we need to reinvest in our education system. So that means we need to somehow form groups that could actively influence policy. And again, we're not advocating for the injection of like left-leaning belief structures into the education system. We're not trying to like deploy woke politics into the school system. I think we're neutrally trying to state that we should have elements in the curriculum that just improve critical thinking and writ large improves the quality of education.
Let's make it very clear. If you think that teaching critical thinking is a left-wing,
it's a woke thing,
you're a fucking more.
Yeah. To go back to a point you made earlier, Andre, about how, to whatever extent people are not already involved or thinking about these things, it's because they feel disenfranchised, they feel like they're helpless. But also, it's important to realize that thinking requires effort. It literally requires calories to engage in these conversations. And if you are expending your resources and your efforts just to stay alive.
So you're just saying we're all hungry on the show? That's why, like,
yeah, I mean,
need more sugar is what you're saying.
If you're spending all your resources and calories just to work a 9-to-5 job and get home and wash your dishes and deal with your kids, you're not going to be physically able to engage in these ideas. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that we can do as a society to promote critical thinking is to provide the safety nets required to give people the slack in order to more deeply engage with these
socialist
I mean, so it's pretty much every economist agrees that universal healthcare is a net good, and it's basically one of the least controversial opinions.
Alex, can you make a single argument that doesn't require elitist logic, please? Just a single.
I mean, if you think that critical thinking requires calories is elitist logic, then I don't know what to tell you, man.
Did I call such a person something earlier?
So, I mean, all this to say is we need to make sure people's basic needs are met. And this is actually, there are concrete proposals and movements that are making headway on creating these safety nets. There's already a huge movement in the US that's growing in power and popularity to promote universal healthcare, to promote universal basic income, that kind of thing. And those are concrete steps that you can take to then make it so that the population is best equipped to deal with these problems. And I think that is another important step in any grassroots movement, is to engage with those as well.
Okay, so this is good. This is good. So we've kind of talked about some cultural changes that have to take place. We've talked about some political changes that should take place. Maybe let's take a moment to think about some of the economic changes that would ultimately have to take place. And again, this doesn't have to be at the very start of the transition. It could be after there is some cultural movement. There has been some changes to the education system. We know that corporate interest is a huge part of the issue. It's a huge source of corruption in our political systems. What can we do? What economic changes would be necessary as a part of this transition? Because so long as we have this total consolidation of wealth and power in a few corporations and individuals, it's going to again be monumentally difficult to make those changes. So, what do you guys think needs to be done on that front?
Well, I already said universal healthcare and UBI. Yeah. That's number one.
Yeah, I wasn't. I guess I wasn't. No.
Yeah, I think universal healthcare. Alex hit the nail on the head. I think that's a huge obstacle to even. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I think that's a huge obstacle to a lot of individuals, willingly stepping in to think about humanity's struggles as opposed to individual struggles. How could we, and like in good faith, how could you ask somebody to consider the impact of like climate change if they can't get by, in their day-to-day lives because they're struggling? I think
so. Just real quick, I think we are putting the cart before the horse here, because what I actually meant by the economic changes is this is kind of like what you're saying, Alex, what you said. This is after I think you've made changes to maybe economic system was not the correct. It's still maybe we're on the political front, because in order to make those changes to say like a UBI, you have to overcome those corporate interests. So when it comes to like economic policy, when it comes to preventing corruption due to this reinforcing loop that we have of the more power, the more wealth you have, the more you can change the rules in the economic rules in your favor to continue to grow your wealth, and then continue to change the system, and so on and so forth.
What you're saying is before we can implement things like universal healthcare and UBI, there are other upstream political and economic issues such as corporate corruption.
Yes. What changes would have to take place there before we can actually?
I don't think we actually need to necessarily solve those problems. At least not fully. I think we can very, very much brute force universal healthcare and UBI without needing to solve corruption at every level of government. I do agree that corruption is a big problem and we do need to address it. But I also don't think it's a fully necessary precondition for implementing some of the most important policies.
Okay. Well, then that settles it.
I think we have to. I think taxation is definitely a standpoint of like what economic reforms we'd have to take into consideration. I think increasing tax burdens on corporations, decreasing tax burdens on individuals is absolute necessity, because we need money obviously for some of the programs that we're talking about. If you want to like better the education system and improve the quality of public schooling, you need to have resources for that, right? And I think that's not going to come around by cutting taxes, for instance.
What about introducing an inheritance tax?
Sure.
Where you kind of reset the game every round, where that UBI is part of that redistribution. Like, okay, here's how we're going to redistribute that money that we've taken from these wealthy individuals. As you approach that next generation, we're going to reset the system actually, and you can't say there's all this corruption because we've taken all this money and given it to literally everybody equally.
Oh shit, that was a hot statement. That was yeah. I agree absolutely. I think that the amount of resistance that would get is paramount as well.
Yeah, there are a ton of proposals for how you go about getting the money for the UBI. There are many different proposals.
I think it all kind of comes back to the original point I was making, is that it always is going to come back to grassroots. It's always going to come back to organizing people at a baseline, at like a community level, to start pushing for these sorts of things. Because whatever system we have right now clearly isn't going to allow or permit that to take hold. Like, I do not foresee us ever passing any sort of UBI based policy under the current circumstances. Like, we couldn't even get basic like student loan relief.
But Andre, I guess that's the question right now, though, is so if we try to lay out this critical path for the transition to this ultimate, meta treaty model of international cooperation and coordination, you've got this grassroots movement, right? You've got chapters around the world in different cities. You've got all this momentum from reforming the education system. You've got hyper agents on social media propping up this movement further. And now you've built up enough political willpower to make actual changes. What do you do on that political and economic front?
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And I think the taxation would be paramount. I think making taxation a policy that ensures buy-in and payback into a system, into a country. I think corporate taxation rates would have to go up, wealth taxes, inheritance taxes.
Immediately someone says, okay, that's going to drive, these corporations into other countries and take business away.
I think herein lies the benefit of a global movement to a certain extent, where if you have a baseline of political coordination across countries, I think it would be a lot harder for Google to jump to between, let's say, we mentioned last episode that this would have to start small, that meta-treaty-esque coordination would probably start between 3, 4, 5 countries. But if those 3, 4, 5 countries aren't willing to host Google or another company that's trying to get out of like a tax burden, well, then that's already a little bit more successful. Granted, Google might just move to North Korea, right? I mean, North Korea has high taxes as well. I think that yes, you would need to make those sorts of changes in order to also provide a basis of revenue that would be needed to drive some of these next step meta treaty institutions into place.
Let me counter some of what you're saying, because I think there's all these potential unintended consequences of things that sound really good. So a few countries, maybe big countries, they coordinate and they say, yeah, like we're going to tax the shit out of these big social media companies, for example, let's say Google. And Google says, okay, like, well, fine, then we're just not going to operate in your countries. And although they might lose revenue by doing so, if they're able to consolidate their influence in the rest of the world or another country, you can start to build kind of like a counter. They can succeed in outcompeting the alternative, Googles that prop up in in these countries that have agreed on these taxation laws, and it could lead to competition, and it could lead to narrative warfare, and they could outcompete them by running propaganda on their platforms, right? And just creating like an anti-movement of sorts. So I mean, I guess there's always, this unknown effect of any change that you make. And that's what makes it so difficult, and I think that's what, I think that's why we need to overcome like ego in terms of like policy decisions.
Not my ego though.
Not yours. Your elitist ego is totally fine.
Thanks.
But you get what I'm saying. It's like if you don't have the ability, this idea of recursion that Alex mentioned, which is a great way to think about it. If you cannot iterate on what you've done, if you can't accept that maybe you didn't make the right decision, then you are potentially going down another path that is equally bad or worse than the current one. So just like some of my 2 cents on that, but.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that kind of falls in line with some of the criticisms we received for the model that was proposed last time. Is that, I mean, is there a realistic way you would be able to get buy-in from corporations, to get buy-in from like the traditional institutions of power? Like, I think that's a valid criticism. I mean, I think the model itself, like creating a mutually beneficial international system that everybody would want, countries are going to willingly participate in because there's a net benefit to participating in it. I mean, the amount of resistance that would get from like an institutional level is huge. And I think that's why the organization of this kind of model, ultimately speaking, is a struggle against entrenched existing mindsets. And I think the consequences of that, well, we know what the consequences are if we don't change our mindsets. I think it's very evident, right? We're hurtling to these sorts of meta crises. We're hurtling towards averse effects from climate change. We're moving very. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's important to understand that the meta treaty model that we proposed is not built upon punitive measures. It is built upon positive
reinforcement,
positive incentives. And so I do think that because it's positive, it's more like if you do this thing, you get this benefit. But if you don't, like, okay, you don't get it. But it ends up, let's just say, producing a less forceful like response in the other direction, right? Because the moment you introduce a punishment, then you are met with a lot more resistance. But if you just say, hey, if you come with me, you get this benefit. If you don't, cool, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot more palatable. So I think
Right.
that's actually one of the good features of the meta treaty model.
Yeah, you have to create an organization that people want to be part of, that they want to join, because it's going to, ultimately speaking, benefit their societies to participate in. And maybe it's an environment where eventually like a tech giant is going to in fact encourage participation in it because it's better for business or something like that. Yeah.
Alex, any ideas here? Any comments to add?
Only that I was very tickled by the mental image that Andre evoked for me when he was talking about knocking on doors, boots on the ground. I had a vision of creating flyers with Daniel Schmachtenberger's face on them and going door to door and giving them to people.
And we need to work with the Girl Scouts. The Girl Scouts will spread our message.
Yeah, free box of cookies with every 10-minute talk on Daniel Schmachtenberger.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I guess, yeah. Go ahead, Andre. Sorry.
I mean, no, I think one of the reasons why maybe Schmachtenberger isn't more recognized, and the reason why somebody like Joe Rogan is, I think ultimately speaking, is because
the middle of the bell curve.
I think Joe Rogan does talk to everybody. I think Joe Rogan is appealing in that he can, very low cost of entry. Schmachtenberger talks to a specific group of people. And I suspect the Schmachtenberger's audience, and I guess ultimately speaking our own audience at this point, would probably be resented by I hate using the term, but the middle of the bell curve, right? I think Schmachtenberger isn't talking to somebody that lives that lives in like rural Nebraska, right? He's talking to somebody. Go ahead.
Yeah, I fully take your point that yes, people say in small towns would kind of balk at this idea if it were just presented to them like kind of like cold. But I think that it really does depend on how you package it. But I actually don't think people. I think people would understand that it's not left versus right. It's not us in the same or similar class against one another. It's us against bad systems and elites that are incredibly greedy. Like that is the us versus them that you need to kind of, that's the narrative that you need to create. And that's actually the reality. It's us versus power hungry people, oftentimes sociopaths, and bad systems or systems that have created perverse incentives. Like we need to create that us versus them, because you're right. It's not people on the tail end of the distribution that follow Schmachtenberger and then the middle of the bell curve that follows Joe Rogan. That's not the us versus them. It's almost everyone on the bell. It's literally like everyone on the bell curve that is in this particular below a certain socioeconomic class versus the people above them. It's like a eat the rich type of thing in a sense, right?
Okay, so are we just advocating for? I mean, no, but like it sounds like a lot of the tenets of what are being discussed is part of like some form of like socialist movement. Like I mean, would this kind of organization only be possible under that kind of? Because it sounds like we've really couched it as like it is a struggle against an elite to a certain extent. Maybe we're not going to take it to the extremes of like communism everywhere and like global revolution, but like it does sound like there are elements of like a class movement here.
This is why I like the Moloch framing that Scott Alexander uses, where he takes the Metacrisis and refers to it as kind of this almost anthropomorphized entity, even though it's not actually an agent, but it kind of functions like one. The reason I like it is because it does allow you to create an us versus them system where them is not any people, it's the landscape of incentives. So you can still take advantage of the tribal us versus them narrative without actually pointing people's chagrin at other people.
But I also think that you want to be careful with that framing because there are people with nefarious intentions, and there are people that are genuine, like provably with genetic differences that propel them in a certain direction that is just bad for humanity. For those people to be in those positions of power,
I call them the Moloch cultists. They're the ones who worship Moloch, and
they're the devils.
They're the equivalent of the Cthulhu cult. And
what is the Cthulhu cult?
In H.P. Lovecraft, you have the Cthulhu, this eldritch entity beyond space and time that's trying to enter our world.
What is an eldritch?
An eldritch entity. It's an entity that is incomprehensible to the mortal mind.
But it's evil.
But it's also evil, yeah. And the cultists are the ones trying to raise it out from the depths, bring it into our world. And that's kind of how I look at the people you're talking about. They're the ones who are in service to this eldritch, self-perpetuating force, even if they don't necessarily explicitly realize it.
But I mean, broadly speaking, though, you are right. I mean, ultimately, like it is us versus the system in the sense that you want to create a system that doesn't get hijacked by these fuckers, right? Like you just that is so. I don't know if there's any system that currently exists where the primary goal is to prevent corruption, like to prevent the system itself from being corrupted. And I think the meta treaty model that we propose, which by the way, you guys should go check that out, episode 1. To get more details on that, and hit the subscribe button. Don't forget that as well. But the sort of beauty in that is its primary goal, almost, or one of its core goals, is to prevent itself from being corrupt. And it is to create a feedback loop that sustains the system's original goals, which is to prevent corruption. So I think that has to be laid out. And I think something, something like the Declaration of Independence, where you just, you've got paragraph after paragraph laying out this is what's going on. And in almost like in a more human language, not it's kind of like rules,
so we need
stipulations.
We need a manifesto, is what you're saying.
More of a manifesto that says, hey, corruption is this big fucking problem that gets in the way of all these systems. Always watch out for it. Snitch on people that are trying to corrupt the system. I don't know. It has to be part of the new paradigm that emerges from from all the solutions that we're proposing for this meta crisis. That has to be part of this new paradigm. But yeah. Any other considerations? Do we really cover everything about the transition?
No. I think we just covered step 1, and not even step 1. I think we really kind of delved into the grassroots element of it. But I think there's so many other valid points that were brought up. How, even if you have these sorts of movements that, over the span of a couple of decades, first of all, do we have decades? I mean, what's the time?
We don't. That's the problem. We don't. So we.
Depends on how. Yeah, depends on how
it depends on the problem, and it depends on how you kind of combine the different probabilities of all these catastrophic risks, for a given time frame. But I think we have maybe a couple decades, 2 to 3 decades, and then I think shit's gonna, you talk about resource depletion, you talk about the effects of climate change, you talk about the AI disinformation, economic disruption from AI, you talk about, Israel, Iran's exchange yesterday. Holy shit, does that not undermine this meta treaty model?
Well, but awesome. I'm glad this is being said out loud. That point yesterday, actually it started April 1st. Israel bombed an Iranian embassy in Syria. in retaliation yesterday, Iran launched a bunch of drones and missiles at Israel, right? Simultaneously, you have Russia invading Ukraine. All of these things that would get in the way of a meta treaty model being effective. So I guess the question here, what is the meta treaty model going to do, or how is it going to bring about a level of coordination internationally between countries that would, quite bluntly, like, want to destroy the other? I think both Israel has proven that takes a very aggressive posture against Iran, and Iran certainly has official slogans chanting "death to Israel." Right? How would the meta treaty model work?
Well, so the way it would work is, first of all, it is not dependent upon all nations agreeing to it in a single moment, right? So it is something where it can start small with a few nations and build up. It's also scalable in the sense that you could try to implement some of the ideas in local government and cities and states, nations. But as far as conflicts like that, because the meta treaty model does not propose a military, you would still need coordination between countries to resolve conflicts at a military level, right? But the whole goal of the meta treaty model is to prevent conflicts from arising within the nations that are a part of the treaty. So as it continues to expand and grow, then it becomes more powerful. It becomes a bigger draw to other nations that are not included. And ultimately, it takes over the earth like a cancer. And no, but like you get the point here. Like, again, you don't have a military because that is far too dangerous, right? At that level, you still have these decentralized military entities, and you still have nations, able to make decisions on the military level as they see necessary, but maybe there are consequences to military action from an economic standpoint or whatever. But the meta treaty model is, I think what's important for people to understand is it started out as an idea of like, hey, if you have an ideal system and a kind of a blank slate in terms of, international cooperation, what would a system, what would that system be? Is it even like possible to have, an ideal start, an ideal system? Does that not also, would that not also kind of fall into some corrupted state? Like that was the original intent of like, is a third, like it's already hard enough to imagine how you could transition to a third attractor system. But I would argue that it's just as difficult to come up with the system itself, even not thinking about a transition. Like, what is this system? Like, what the hell is this thing that doesn't get corrupted or doesn't allow itself to be corrupted? And it's not clear to me, like, we developed it, obviously it's just an idea. It's, it would have to be iterated upon. It's maybe implemented at small scales. You could see how it actually behaves in the real world. The advantage of existing systems, no matter how corrupt they are, is that at least thus far, I guess, that they haven't led to total catastrophe thus far, but they are leading to it. I mean, they haven't resulted in total catastrophe thus far, but like we are going in that direction. So,
and to be fair, like every iteration of international government, quote unquote, that we've had has been an improvement over the previous. Like the League of Nations was complete shit at managing conflict, that they were unable to prevent conflict from happening in Asia Pacific and South America. Obviously, World War II happened, technically speaking, during the era of the League of Nations, though it collapsed like around the time when the war kicked off. But then the United Nations was formed, and you kind of built on the legacy of League of Nations. You included more countries with relevant positions of power. You introduced like cycles where countries could sit on the Security Council. It's not perfect. In fact, maybe it's complete shit. But the next version on top of that would be even better, right? And I think we're not rejecting the United Nations nor promoting it. We're just offering up a solution to prevent the corruption of the United Nations from taking fold in the next era of organization.
Well, that leads me to actually a great maybe transition to, is it better to reform the existing systems than try to transition to a new one, given that, a new system could involve some sort of revolution or whatever, which is, has its own catastrophic consequences possibly. So Alex, what do you think about reforming existing systems, iterative reforms, as opposed to, just a completely new system?
Yeah, I don't think it's a dichotomy. I think every new system is going to require reforms and transitions. So, and every transition and reform ultimately leads to a new system, ultimately. So, I don't think it's a dichotomy.
Okay. But what, it was poorly phrased, that question, because so when I said reforms, I meant that you change the system in small ways, but you more or less still have a very similar system to the UN, right? Like say, okay, you've made a few changes. Maybe you've removed the veto power of the Security Council members, and you've improved the military capacity, the peacekeeping force. You've done these small changes. Maybe you've introduced like some financial transparency. Okay, it's like a new system, but it's kind of still very similar to the old. Like, do you think by necessity, if some of these changes are made, again, as a result of certain black swan events or whatever, do you think that the norms themselves that are established as a result, like you talk about like the US government and the norms that we had and how Donald Trump broke it, and we see that, okay, well, it's actually a lot of these things, it was operating under norms. Do you think that's enough to sustain some sort of stability in the world? Because without a genuinely new system, I think you're going to fall into the same systemic traps, right?
I think if you adjust the rationality that is making the changes and utilizing the system, I think you can, at the very least, make a stopgap. I think there are reforms we could make to the existing system that could buy us another couple decades, giving us the time needed to create new systems from whole cloth, if that's what you're getting at.
Okay. That also settled it then. You just one banger after another, Just
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah. Andre, your input is required.
I think it depends on, again, time frame. I think if the conclusion is that we don't have time, I think reforming existing systems probably isn't an option. I think if the window is rapidly closing, like if we truly believe, what's up?
Yeah,
no, it just sounded like you were about to go like full Unabomber, like reforming the existing systems is not an option.
Not sufficient.
No, God, no.
Burn it all down.
No, but I think this is where it would be very fascinating watching this kind of political movement unfold, because like any political movement, we would probably develop radicalism in certain sects of our belief system. So like the radical movement behind the Metacrisis would almost see anything in opposition to it as an existential threat to humanity. Because if the foundation of the movement is a belief that these metacrises are an existential risk to humanity, and if we don't resolve them, then we're going to cease to exist, then a radical within this movement would interpret any opposition to that as, to Alex's point, a cultist, a supporter of Moloch.
But it's a perversion, right, of the idea, because one of the core principles at least, the way Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about it is, hey, like there's all these unintended consequences, right, of particular actions and behaviors. And the idea of trying to like silence the opposition, even if you think it's for a good end, can lead to a worse outcome. Like that's one of the key tenets. So I think, it was really an education problem, but you're absolutely right. Like, you would have some fraction or faction of the Metacrisis movement devolve into a cultist, extremist kind of thing.
In fact, then joining the ranks of the supporters of Moloch, they would be they'd be perverting the system from the inside.
That's how Moloch gets you.
Yeah, the Satan gets you. Satan tempts you.
Moloch has his fingers in every pie, including yours.
But to that end,
God.
I think, oh yeah, my pie is being fingered. I think if we accept that
we're mature adults,
yes, if we accept that they're
solving the Metacrisis one pie at a time,
yeah. If we accept that there is no time and that we need to move quickly, I think reforming the existing institution, let's say the United Nations, probably isn't enough. I think we'd have to get to work on building our own and move from there.
And beat the existing United Nations.
Yeah, it would be the parallel United Nations,
a competing United Nations.
Right.
The beatings will stop when morale improves.
Right. I mean, I could totally see this movement getting completely co-opted by radicalism and.
Well, I mean, yeah, but I think we have to keep like a certain perspective here, because it's always easy to like lay these criticisms on any idea, like,
and they will be laid on us,
right? Like, I mean, they have been by our very astute, YouTube viewers with their sophisticated comments.
I will say, I just have to take this moment. I want to give a shout out to our man Chinchilla Fur, or man or woman, the anonymous Chinchilla Fur. Thank you for blowing up our section. That made my day.
Yeah, well done. Hope you're doing well, by the way.
we'll send you a shirt when we got them.
But what was I getting at here? What was the point? What was the last thing that we were talking about?
Radicalism taking hold of the movement.
No, after that.
The criticisms. The criticisms of it.
The criticisms. Yeah, the criticisms. And then what? Was there something else after that too? Can you just reconstruct my entire mind piece by piece so I can know exactly where I left off?
I'm working on it. That's
yeah, we haven't perfected the technology for that quite yet.
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, I totally lost my train of thought. But I think, I still have lost my train. I just continually, I'm recursively losing
just to recap,
train of
the
thought.
things that we've talked about. We've talked about, generally speaking, how this kind of needs to be a grassroots movement in order to adjust the underlying rationality of the systems. And in order to do that, you need to create compelling narratives. You need to get people excited. You need to give them the resources needed so they can focus on these highbrow ideas instead of spending all their time and effort surviving day to day. Then there are some economic reforms that you would probably need to make as well, including reduction of corruption. What else do we talk about? What were the other transitional solutions?
Hyper agents.
Yes, hyper agents.
My favorite thing of all time.
This is actually one of the reasons I don't consider Daniel Schmachtenberger a hyper agent. As amazing of a human as he is, even more so than I am.
Wow.
One of the key skills a hyper agent would need to have is the ability to connect with the common person. I don't mean that in a condescending way. I think I am a common person in many ways, but like someone who is a hyper agent needs to be able to connect to the Rust Belt blue collar worker and communicate these ideas in such a way that the Rust Belt blue collar worker understands and is concerned about the ideas.
There can be multiple hyper agents, so it's like a kind of it's not a binary choice whether you need to only communicate.
I think communication with the most common denominator of human is a pretty fundamental skill for a hyper agent.
Right, but also communicating to the people with the most, like, with disproportionate influence and power, sure, is also important, because that's just the right kind of levers to pull. So I think you need a combination, and the gist of this is there is no single solution to the meta crisis, right? It is just as the meta crisis doesn't have a single source of problems, like it's multiple variables involved, it's multiple problems, and it's interconnected, and it's a non-linear thing, and it's hard to predict, and this and that. In the same way, you need a host of issues to be resolved to address it, and you need a movement that is grassroots oriented. You need political change. You need economic change. You need hyper agents. You need people to also maybe make some sacrifices. People not interested in that these days. Not interested in anything other than themselves. It seems like we've entered a large scale society where we kind of don't rely on any single person. We rely on the system, but that kind of has dehumanized things to a certain extent. And it has made the idea of sacrifice kind of almost a foreign thing, where back in the day, in the small tribe, you would absolutely make these sacrifices every day, and you would do it because it would be so obvious that it benefits you. But now we've lost touch of that. And so I think sacrifice, it's a word that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think people need to think more about how they are making a sacrifice to not just obviously for the system or for the collective good, but also to people that they're close to. So I think that's like a thing, that a trend that should be started as well as a part of the grassroots movement. Yeah. And
I think this kind of goes to what John Vervaeke talks about when he talks about wisdom, and how wisdom is a key element of wisdom is restraint. And in this context, restraint would take the form of declining to participate in certain systems, like being willing to give up certain comforts and being willing to give up certain luxuries that you might currently enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh yeah, community is another thing we touched on, like having some kind of group that is dedicated to these ideas and ideals.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, maybe last point here, Andre. You mentioned, the Catholic Church last time. You mentioned things that we can extract from it. You mentioned that we may need a sort of religious devotion to this cause, and a kind of harmony in values and a unification in narrative to really be successful. Any further thoughts on that, like concretely as it pertains to this transition?
I think it's bringing back humanity to a struggle that goes beyond the individual, I think, is a very important thing. And I think that's one of the strongest things that religion does offer. It places the individual almost on like a cosmic path, in this instance with God, that, God created you and you're going to be going back to God after you die. So that does break away monotony, and it does maybe prompt one to work closer with their neighbors, to take care of the poor, to go on massacres, all these things that religious devotion draws people into. And I think recognizing that everybody faces a collective threat from the meta crisis, And building a movement off of that could place a level of invigoration into people's lives that we mentioned multiple times throughout the call is, in fact, one of the obstacles that I think our movement would have to deal with.
Yeah, I think this ties in really nicely with the search for secular spirituality. I think we're entering a post-religious world. Like the most rapidly growing religious demographic are people who don't identify with an organized religion. And this is having a lot of consequences on our world. People don't have unifying narratives anymore. They don't have a sense of the sacred. They don't have a feeling that their life has meaning. And all these things are important tangentially in order to combat the metacrisis. Because if your life has no meaning and you don't have a tribe, you don't have any unifying narratives, there's no coordination that's going to happen in that world. And I think that is people talk about religion. We've mentioned religion a number of times. And there are bad parts of religion, like the epistemology of faith without evidence and reason. I think that's a component of religion. But a good component of religion is how it elevates the highest of values and helps you figure that out and align your life with that highest of value in order to create a compelling narrative, in order to make sense of the world. I think that is what we need to find in order to combat the metacrisis.
And what better purpose than to, dedicate your entire life to solving the metacrisis?
And what else are you going to do?
Seriously. So with that said, thank you everybody for listening. Another unbelievably, incredibly, fascinatingly great episode of Radius of Reason.
And we would encourage you all to let us know your thoughts on how feasible this kind of movement would be in the comment section. Tell us what you think about a one world government coming in to tell you what to do with your money.
Yeah, all the comments.
And
please give us that sweet, sweet engagement.
And don't forget the subscribe button, the greatest hyper agent of all.
And like the video to let YouTube's algorithm know that this video is good.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And thanks as always to our guest, Alex.
Always good to have Alex.
Happy to be here, guys. Love chatting with you.
Well done. Well done. And we'll see you all next time.
Bye.
Adios.